Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Milton Friedman on Economics, Selected Papers, by Milton Friedman, afterward by Gary S. Becker, narrated by Kyle Snyder. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type Milton Friedman on Economics into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then, under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code MARKET, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All figures, tables, and charts referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Nobel Lecture: Inflation and Unemployment. When the Bank of Sweden established the prize for economic science in memory of Alfred Nobel in 1968, there doubtless was, as there doubtless still remains, widespread skepticism among both scientists and the broader public about the appropriateness of treating economics as parallel to physics, chemistry, and medicine. These are regarded as exact sciences, in which objective, cumulative, definitive knowledge is possible. Economics and its fellow social sciences are regarded more nearly as branches of philosophy than of science properly defined, enmeshed with values at the outset because they deal with human behavior. Do not the social sciences, in which scholars are analyzing the behavior of themselves and their fellow men, who are, in turn, observing and reacting to what the scholars say, require fundamentally different methods of investigation than the physical and biological sciences? Should they not be judged by different criteria? 1. Social and natural sciences. I have never myself accepted this view. I believe that it reflects a misunderstanding, not so much of the character and possibilities of social science, as of the character and possibilities of natural science. In both, there is no certain substantive knowledge, only tentative hypotheses that can never be proved, but can only fail to be rejected, hypotheses in which we may have more or less confidence, depending on such features as the breadth of experience they encompass relative to their own complexity, and relative to alternative hypotheses, and the number of occasions on which they have escaped possible rejection. In both social and natural sciences, the body of positive knowledge grows by the failure of a tentative hypothesis to predict phenomena that the hypothesis professes to explain, by the patching up of that hypothesis until someone suggests a new hypothesis that more elegantly or simply embodies the troublesome phenomena, and so on ad infinitum. In both, experiment is sometimes possible, sometimes not, witness meteorology. In both, no experiment is ever completely controlled, and experience often offers evidence that is the equivalent of controlled experiment. In both, there is no way to have a self-contained, closed system, or to avoid interaction between the observer and the observed. The Gödel theorem in mathematics, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in physics, the self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecy in the social sciences all exemplify these limitations. Of course, the different sciences deal with different subject matter, have different bodies of evidence to draw on. For example, introspection is a more important source of evidence for social than for natural sciences. Find different techniques of analysis most useful, and have achieved differential success in predicting the phenomena they are studying. But such differences are as great among, say, physics, biology, medicine, and meteorology as between any of them and economics. Even the difficult problem of separating value judgments from scientific judgments is not unique to the social sciences. I well recall a dinner at a Cambridge University college when I was sitting between a fellow economist and R.A. Fisher, the great mathematical statistician and geneticist. My fellow economist told me about a student he had been tutoring on labor economics, who, in connection with an analysis of the effect of trade unions, remarked, "Well, surely, Mr. X," another economist of a different political persuasion, "would not agree with that." My colleague regarded this experience as a terrible indictment of economics, because it illustrated the impossibility of a value-free, positive economic science. I turned to Sir Ronald and asked whether such an experience was indeed unique to social science. His answer was an impassioned no, and he proceeded to tell one story after another about how accurately he could infer views in genetics from political views. One of my great teachers, Wesley C. Mitchell, impressed on me the basic reason why scholars have every incentive to pursue a value-free science, whatever their values and however strongly they may wish to spread and promote them. In order to recommend a course of action to achieve an objective, we must first know whether that course of action will in fact promote the objective. Positive scientific knowledge that enables us to predict the consequences of a possible course of action is clearly a prerequisite for the normative judgment whether that course of action is desirable. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, precisely because of the neglect of this rather obvious point. This point is particularly important in economics. Many countries around the world are today experiencing socially destructive inflation, abnormally high unemployment, misuse of economic resources, and, in some cases, the suppression of human freedom, not because evil men deliberately sought to achieve these results, nor because of differences in values among their citizens, but because of erroneous judgments about the consequences of government measures, errors that, at least in principle, are capable of being corrected by the progress of positive economic science. Rather than pursue these ideas in the abstract, I shall illustrate the positive scientific character of economics by discussing a particular economic issue that has been a major concern of the economics profession throughout the post-war period, namely, the relation between inflation and unemployment. This issue is an admirable illustration because it has been a controversial political issue throughout the period. Yet the drastic change that has occurred in accepted professional views was produced primarily by the scientific response to experience that contradicted a tentatively accepted hypothesis, precisely the classical process for the revision of a scientific hypothesis. I cannot give here an exhaustive survey of the work that has been done on this issue, or of the evidence that has led to the revision of the hypothesis. I shall be able only to skim the surface in the hope of conveying the flavor of that work and that evidence and of indicating the major items requiring further investigation. Professional controversy about the relation between inflation and unemployment has been intertwined with controversy about the relative role of monetary, fiscal, and other factors in influencing aggregate demand. One issue deals with how a change in aggregate nominal demand, however produced, works itself out through changes in employment and price levels. The other, with the factors accounting for the change in aggregate nominal demand. The two issues are closely related. The effects of a change in aggregate nominal demand on employment and price levels may not be independent of the source of the change, and conversely, the effect of monetary, fiscal, or other forces on aggregate nominal demand may depend on how employment and price levels react. A full analysis will clearly have to treat the two issues jointly. Yet, there is a considerable measure of independence between them. To a first approximation, the effects on employment and price levels may depend only on the magnitude of the change in aggregate nominal demand, not on its source. On both issues, professional opinion today is very different than it was just after World War II, because experience contradicted tentatively accepted hypotheses. Either issue could therefore serve to illustrate my main thesis. I have chosen to deal with only one in order to keep this lecture within reasonable bounds. I have chosen to make that one the relation between inflation and unemployment, because recent experience leaves me less satisfied with the adequacy of my earlier work on that issue than with the adequacy of my earlier work on the forces producing changes in aggregate nominal demand. 2. Stage 1. Negatively sloping Phillips curve. Professional analysis of the relation between inflation and unemployment has gone through two stages since the end of World War II, and is now entering a third. The first stage was the acceptance of a hypothesis associated with the name of A. W. Phillips, 1958, that there is a stable, negative relation between the level of unemployment and the rate of change of wages, high levels of unemployment being accompanied by falling wages, low levels of unemployment by rising wages. The wage change in turn was linked to price change by allowing for the secular increase in productivity and treating the excess of price over wage cost as given by a roughly constant markup factor. Figure 1, which can be found in the accompanying bonus PDF, illustrates this hypothesis, where I have followed the standard practice of relating unemployment directly to price change, short-circuiting the intermediate step through wages. This relation was widely interpreted as a causal relation that offered a stable trade-off to policymakers. They could choose a low unemployment target, such as U sub L. In that case, they would have to accept an inflation rate of A. There would remain the problem of choosing the measures, monetary, fiscal, perhaps other, that would produce the level of aggregate nominal demand required to achieve U sub L. But if that were done, there need be no concern about maintaining that combination of unemployment and inflation. Alternatively, the policymakers could choose a low inflation rate or even deflation as their target. In that case, they would have to reconcile themselves to higher unemployment, U sub 0 for zero inflation, U sub H for deflation. Economists then busied themselves with trying to extract the relation depicted in Figure 1 from evidence for different countries and periods, to eliminate the effect of extraneous disturbances, to clarify the relation between wage change and price change, and so on. In addition, they explored social gains and losses from inflation on the one hand, and unemployment on the other, in order to facilitate the choice of the right trade-off. Unfortunately for this hypothesis, additional evidence failed to conform with it. Empirical estimates of the Phillips curve relation were unsatisfactory. More important, the inflation rate that appeared to be consistent with a specified level of unemployment did not remain fixed. In the circumstances of the post-World War II period, when governments everywhere were seeking to promote full employment, it tended in any one country to rise over time and to vary sharply among countries. Looked at the other way, rates of inflation that had earlier been associated with low levels of unemployment were experienced along with high levels of unemployment. The phenomenon of simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment increasingly forced itself on public and professional notice, receiving the unlovely label of stagflation. Some of us were skeptical from the outset about the validity of a stable Phillips curve, primarily on theoretical rather than empirical grounds. What mattered for employment, we argued, was not wages in dollars or pounds or kroner, but real wages, what the wages would buy in goods and services. Low unemployment would, indeed, mean pressure for a higher real wage, but real wages could be higher even if nominal wages were lower, provided that prices were still lower. Similarly, high unemployment would, indeed, mean pressure for a lower real wage. But real wages could be lower, even if nominal wages were higher, provided prices were still higher. There is no need to assume a stable Phillips curve in order to explain the apparent tendency for an acceleration of inflation to reduce unemployment. That can be explained by the impact of unanticipated changes in nominal demand on markets characterized by, implicit or explicit, long-term commitments with respect to both capital and labor. Long-term labor commitments can be explained by the cost of acquiring information by employers about employees and by employees about alternative employment opportunities, plus the specific human capital that makes an employee's value to a particular employer grow over time and exceed his value to other potential employers. Only surprises matter. If everyone anticipated that prices would rise at, say, 20% a year, then this anticipation would be embodied in future wage and other contracts. Real wages would then behave precisely as they would if everyone anticipated no price rise, and there would be no reason for the 20% rate of inflation to be associated with a different level of unemployment than a zero rate. An unanticipated change is very different, especially in the presence of long-term commitments, themselves partly a result of the imperfect knowledge whose effect they enhance and spread over time. Long-term commitments mean, first, that there is not instantaneous market clearing, as in markets for perishable foods, but only a lagged adjustment of both prices and quantity to changes in demand or supply, as in the house rental market. Second, that commitments entered into depend not only on current observable prices, but also on the prices expected to prevail throughout the term of the commitment. 3. Stage 2. Natural Rate Hypothesis. Proceeding along these lines, we, in particular, E.S. Phelps and myself, developed an alternative hypothesis that distinguished between the short-run and long-run effects of unanticipated changes in aggregate nominal demand. Start from some initial stable position and let there be, for example, an unanticipated acceleration of aggregate nominal demand. This will come to each producer as an unexpectedly favorable demand for his product. In an environment in which changes are always occurring in the relative demand for different goods, he will not know whether this change is special to him or pervasive. It will be rational for him to interpret it as at least partly special and to react to it by seeking to produce more to sell at what he now perceives to be a higher than expected market price for future output. He will be willing to pay higher nominal wages than he had been willing to pay before in order to attract additional workers. The real wage that matters to him is the wage in terms of the price of his product, and he perceives that price as higher than before. A higher nominal wage can therefore mean a lower real wage as perceived by him. To workers, the situation is different. What matters to them is the purchasing power of wages, not over the particular good they produce, but over all goods in general. Both they and their employers are likely to adjust more slowly their perception of prices in general, because it is more costly to acquire information about that, than their perception of the price of the particular good they produce. As a result, a rise in nominal wages may be perceived by workers as a rise in real wages, and hence call forth an increased supply, at the same time that it is perceived by employers as a fall in real wages, and hence calls forth an increased offer of jobs. Expressed in terms of the average of perceived future prices, real wages are lower. In terms of the perceived future average price, real wages are higher. But this situation is temporary. Let the higher rate of growth of aggregate nominal demand and of prices continue, and perceptions will adjust to reality. When they do, the initial effect will disappear and then even be reversed for a time as workers and employers find themselves locked into inappropriate contracts. Ultimately, employment will be back at the level that prevailed before the assumed unanticipated acceleration in aggregate nominal demand. This alternative hypothesis is depicted in Figure 2 in the bonus PDF. Each negatively sloping curve is a Phillips curve like that in Figure 1, except that it is for a particular anticipated or perceived rate of inflation, defined as the perceived average rate of price change, not the average of perceived rates of individual price change. The order of the curves would be reversed for the second concept. Start from point E and let the rate of inflation, for whatever reason, move from A to B and stay there. Unemployment would initially decline to U sub L at point F, moving along the curve defined for an anticipated rate of inflation. The quantity 1 divided by capital P times the derivative of capital P with respect to T, star of A. As anticipations adjusted, the short-run curve would move upward, ultimately to the curve defined for an anticipated inflation rate of B. Concurrently, unemployment would move gradually over from F to G. This analysis is, of course, oversimplified. It supposes a single unanticipated change, whereas, of course, there is a continuing stream of unanticipated changes. It does not deal explicitly with lags, or with overshooting, or with the process of formation of anticipations. But it does highlight the key points. What matters is not inflation per se, but unanticipated inflation. There is no stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. There is a natural rate of unemployment, U sub n, which is consistent with the real forces and with accurate perceptions. Unemployment can be kept below that level only by an accelerating inflation, or above it only by accelerating deflation. The natural rate of unemployment, a term I introduced to parallel Knut Wicksell's natural rate of interest, is not a numerical constant, but depends on real as opposed to monetary factors: the effectiveness of the labor market, the extent of competition or monopoly, the barriers or encouragements to working in various occupations, and so on. For example, the natural rate has clearly been rising in the United States for two major reasons. First, women, teenagers, and part-time workers have been constituting a growing fraction of the labor force. These groups are more mobile in employment than other workers, entering and leaving the labor market, shifting more frequently between jobs. As a result, they tend to experience higher average rates of unemployment. Second, unemployment insurance and other forms of assistance to unemployed persons have been made available to more categories of workers and have become more generous in duration and amount. Workers who lose their jobs are under less pressure to look for other work, will tend to wait longer in the hope, generally fulfilled, of being recalled to their former employment, and can be more selective in the alternatives they consider. Further, the availability of unemployment insurance makes it more attractive to enter the labor force in the first place, and so may itself have stimulated both the growth that has occurred in the labor force as a percentage of the population and its changing composition. The determinants of the natural rate of unemployment deserve much fuller analysis for both the United States and other countries. So also do the meaning of the recorded unemployment figures and the relation between the recorded figures and the natural rate. These issues are all of the utmost importance for public policy. However, they are side issues for my present limited purpose. The connection between the state of employment and the level of efficiency or productivity of an economy is another topic that is of fundamental importance for public policy, but is a side issue for my present purpose. There is a tendency to take it for granted that a high level of recorded unemployment is evidence of inefficient use of resources, and conversely. This view is seriously in error. A low level of unemployment may be a sign of a forced draft economy that is using its resources inefficiently and is inducing workers to sacrifice leisure for goods that they value less highly than the leisure under the mistaken belief that their real wages will be higher than they prove to be. Or, a low natural rate of unemployment may reflect institutional arrangements that inhibit change. A highly static, rigid economy may have a fixed place for everyone, whereas a dynamic, highly progressive economy, which offers ever-changing opportunities and fosters flexibility, may have a high natural rate of unemployment. To illustrate how the same rate may correspond to very different conditions, both Japan and the United Kingdom had low average rates of unemployment from, say, 1950 to 1970. But Japan experienced rapid growth, the United Kingdom, stagnation. The natural rate, or accelerationist, or expectations-adjusted Phillips curve hypothesis, as it has been variously designated, is by now widely accepted by economists, though by no means universally. A few still cling to the original Phillips curve. More recognize the difference between short-run and long-run curves, but regard even the long-run curve as negatively sloped, though more steeply so than the short-run curves. Some substitute a stable relation between the acceleration of inflation and unemployment for a stable relation between inflation and unemployment, aware of but not concerned about the possibility that the same logic that drove them to a second derivative will drive them to even higher derivatives. Much current economic research is devoted to exploring various aspects of this second stage, the dynamics of the process, the formation of expectations, and the kind of systematic policy, if any, that can have a predictable effect on real magnitudes. We can expect rapid progress on these issues. Special mention should be made of the work on rational expectations, especially the seminal contributions of John Muth, Robert Lucas, and Thomas Sargent. 4. Stage 3. A positively sloped Phillips curve? Although the second stage is far from having been fully explored, let alone fully absorbed into the economic literature, the course of events is already producing a move to a third stage. In recent years, higher inflation has often been accompanied by higher, not lower, unemployment, especially for periods of several years in length. A simple statistical Phillips curve for such periods seems to be positively sloped, not vertical. The third stage is directed at accommodating this apparent empirical phenomenon. To do so, I suspect that it will have to include in the analysis the interdependence of economic experience and political developments. It will have to treat at least some political phenomena not as independent variables, as exogenous variables in econometric jargon, but as themselves determined by economic events, as endogenous variables. Gordon, 1975b. The second stage was greatly influenced by two major developments in economic theory of the past few decades. One, the analysis of imperfect information and of the cost of acquiring information, pioneered by George Stigler. The other, the role of human capital in determining the form of labor contracts, pioneered by Gary Becker. The third stage will, I believe, be greatly influenced by a third major development, the application of economic analysis to political behavior, a field in which pioneering work has also been done by Stigler and Becker, as well as by Kenneth Arrow, Duncan Black, Anthony Downs, James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, and others. The apparent positive relation between inflation and unemployment has been a source of great concern to government policymakers. Let me quote from a recent speech by Prime Minister Callaghan of Great Britain. "We used to think that you could just spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you, in all candor, that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by higher levels of unemployment as the next step. That is the history of the past 20 years. The same view is expressed in a Canadian government white paper. Continuing inflation, particularly in North America, has been accompanied by an increase in measured unemployment rates. These are remarkable statements, running as they do directly counter to the policies adopted by almost every Western government throughout the post-war period. A. Some evidence. More systematic evidence for the past 2 decades is given in Table 1 and Figures 3 and 4, which show the rates of inflation and unemployment in 7 industrialized countries over the past 2 decades. According to the 5-year averages in Table 1, the rate of inflation and the level of unemployment moved in opposite directions, the expected simple Phillips curve outcome, in 5 out of 7 countries between the first 2 quinquennia, 1956 to 60, 1961 to 65. In only 4 out of 7 countries between the second and third quinquennia, 1961 to 65 and 1966 to 70, and in only 1 out of 7 countries between the final 2 quinquennia, 1966 to 70 and 1970 to 75. And even the one exception, Italy, is not a real exception. True, unemployment averaged a shade lower from 1971 to 1975 than in the prior 5 years, despite a more than tripling of the rate of inflation. However, since 1973, both inflation and unemployment have risen sharply. The averages for all 7 countries plotted in Figure 3 bring out even more clearly the shift from a negatively sloped simple Phillips curve to a positively sloped one. The 2 curves move in opposite directions between the first 2 quinquennia, in the same direction thereafter. The annual data in Figure 4 tell a similar, though more confused, story. In the early years, there is wide variation in the relation between prices and unemployment, varying from essentially no relation, as in Italy, to a fairly clear-cut year-to-year negative relation, as in the United Kingdom and the United States. In recent years, however, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan all show a clearly marked rise in both inflation and unemployment, though for Japan, the rise in unemployment is much smaller relative to the rise in inflation than in the other countries, reflecting the different meaning of unemployment in the different institutional environment of Japan. Only Sweden and Italy fail to conform to the general pattern. Of course, these data are at most suggestive. We do not really have 7 independent bodies of data. Common international influences affect all countries, so that multiplying the number of countries does not multiply proportionately the amount of evidence.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?